In part because of these ideological and social tensions, Southern rationalization of slavery changed in the 19th century. Prior to the Revolution, Southerners had often characterized slavery as a necessary evil, arguing that over time it would naturally fade away. The advent of cotton, however, ensured that slavery remained a viable economic system. Many Southerners adjusted to this reality by shifting towards defining slavery not as a necessary evil, but rather a positive good. They based this justification upon several points. First, they increasingly ascribed to the idea that African Americans were inherently racially inferior, and this not included in the revolutionary promises of equality. If they were less than fully human, there was no contradiction in denying them human rights. Arguing that the essential nature of African Americans was childish and dependent, slave owners crafted an identity for themselves as paternalistic guardians. In exchange for labor and obedience, masters provided basic care and guidance. In this worldview, they were actually doing a favor to African Americans by holding them in bondage, since, according to this ideology, they were incapable of caring for themselves. The increasing emphasis upon racism also would prove to be a useful tool in ensuring the support of non-slaveholders. While they didn't economically benefit from slavery, they often accepted the racist ideology that went along with it, and thus supported the system, which affirmed their psychological superiority as white free men. In the South, the key social cleavages were between free and unfree, white and black, not between poor and wealthy. Second, Southern intellectuals found evidence in the classics and in the Bible that supported their point of view. They pointed to the fact that the great civilizations of the past, such as Greece and Rome, had used slavery, although they failed to note that this was typically not racial slavery. They also observed that the old patriarchs of the Bible had had slaves. Thus, they suggested, it was condoned by Christianity. Third, they compared slavery to the free labor system of the North. Northern rhetoric about the benefits of free labor, they argued, simply masked the true philosophy of the North. Every man for himself, and the devil take the hindmost. They suggested that wage workers in the North were poorly treated, and when they became ill or old, they were simply discarded and sent to the poorhouse. Factory owners took no responsibility for their workers outside the workplace. In contrast, Southerners suggested, the master took care of his workers, ensuring they had sufficient food, clothing, and shelter, and when they grew too old to work, continued to support them. Thus, they argued, Southern society fostered warm, familial relationships versus the cold-hearted, selfish capitalism of Northern money grubbers. With the transformation of slavery into a positive good, it became increasingly difficult for any Southerners to criticize the institution. During the early decades of the 19th century, there had been persistent critics of slavery within the South, most notably in the Upper South, where scattered emancipation societies continued to promote gradual emancipation and the colonization of freed African Americans outside the United States. As late as 1832, in a debate over the status of slavery sparked by Nate Turner's rebellion, some members of the Virginia House of Burgesses condemned slavery as a social canker and an economic blight, but this was one of the last times the issue was openly debated in the South. White Southerners were driven to this increasingly belligerent defense of slavery not only to assuage their own consciences, but also because they faced growing criticism from the North, and indeed from world opinion. To muster their arguments, they created a variety of Southern institutions that propagated this positive image of slavery. In Southern colleges, the students were imbued with these principles, conveyed by textbooks written for this purpose. Over 30 journals were founded in the early 19th century that specifically used the word Southern in their title, journals which again promoted a distinctly regional viewpoint, particularly on the institution of slavery. Even churches became partisans in this ideological struggle. Prior to the 1840s, Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists had been national in scope. In the 1840s, these churches split into distinctive northern and southern wings. The insistence upon the development of a unique Southern attitude towards slavery ensured widespread support for the system within the region. Even though only a minority of white farmers actually owned slaves, the majority still supported the system. In part, this reflected the spread of racist ideology, which provided poor whites with a symbolic membership in the ruling class. Many poorer farmers undoubtedly admired the success of their slaveholding neighbors and hoped to, eventually, imitate them. To become a slaveholding planter remained the pinnacle of success in the South. The planter elite also deliberately cultivated their poorer neighbors, acting as benevolent patrons. Because of this, Southern yeoman farmers often simply deferred to them in matters of politics and policy, particularly since, as largely subsistence farmers, they wanted little from government except to be left alone and free of taxes. The effort to ideologically justify slavery may have helped solidify the power of the planter elite and soothe their consciences, but it thinly papered over the harsh reality of the institution. The quality of life for African Americans held in bondage was frequently very poor, with inadequate food and housing a common occurrence. More often than not, masters provided the bare minimum: a monotonous diet consisting mostly of corn and pork, coarse clothing made of cheap material, living quarters that were typically drafty, cramped, and scantily furnished. Forced to work in the fields for long hours, masters sought to extract the maximum amount of effort out of their slaves with corporal punishment. Casual violence was very much part of the slave system. During the 18th century, it had not been unusual to punish slaves who ran away or otherwise misbehaved with severe mutilation, such as castration or branding. By the 19th century, these practices had waned considerably, in part because with the end of the slave trade and the growing market for slaves in the Lower South, they became too valuable. Whipping and other forms of torture that were less damaging remained common. Records from one plantation, for instance, showed that, on average, a slave received a whipping about every 4 days. Although, without any kind of comprehensive statistics, it's difficult to say whether this reflects the norm. Rape was another form of violence that was quite common on plantations, although, again, it's quite difficult to quantify. The fact that a large portion of the present-day African American population in the United States have significant European DNA tends to support this idea. Mortality statistics also suggest the rigors of life in slavery. On average, African Americans in the early 19th century could expect to live 20 years less than the rest of the population at birth. African Americans held in bondage also suffered from psychological abuse. Although they embraced family life whenever possible, it was extraordinarily difficult to maintain normal familial relations. Imagine the horror of parents who could not protect their children from abuse, who faced at every moment the prospect of having their children sold to a distant plantation, never to be seen again. The same was true of relationships between husband and wife. How must it have felt for husbands to be unable to protect their wives from being raped or whipped, for wives to see their husbands being beaten? Consider this. It was not uncommon for white masters to father children with their slaves, in part because light-skinned slaves fetched a higher price. Imagine the utter depravity of this, of a father selling his own children for profit. Why didn't African Americans held in bondage simply rebel? There were some instances of this, including a few significant uprisings in the 19th century. In 1800, a revolt headed by Gabriel Prosser was betrayed before any action could be taken. Prosser and 26 of his followers were hanged. 11 years later, in Louisiana, hundreds of slaves rose up and marched on New Orleans, burning plantations along the way. Before they could reach the city, though, they were stopped by federal troops, who killed 66 outright. The leaders of the revolt were taken to New Orleans, where they were executed and their severed heads placed on poles on the road leading to the city. Finally, in 1831, Nate Turner led a rebellion in Virginia. He killed his master's household and then proceeded to other plantations, where he gathered a following. Before being stopped by the Virginia militia, they killed dozens more. Yet, outright rebellion remained comparatively rare. Demographically, African Americans were typically not the majority population. They also tended to live on scattered farms and plantations, making it difficult to create a coordinated resistance or uprising. This was also one reason why Southern states passed laws against teaching slaves to read or write. They didn't want them to have the ability to communicate or learn about the world outside the plantation.